This next section is Horkheimer's review of Bergson's The Two Sources of Morality in Religion, 1933. To contrast this with the section on Spengler before, while Spengler's error is glorifying domination, Bergson's error is spiritualizing emancipation. One views history as power, while the other views it as creativity. Both are referencing the real appearance of phenomena, but both miss the concrete social conditions that make either possible. Bergson posits that human beings can break beyond existing social norms and institutions. However, he understands this breakthrough through mystical intuitions in exceptional individuals rather than through historical and social contradictions. Since I imagine most people here won't be familiar with Bergson, what he's talking about is that there is for him a closed morality, which holds society together and is part of maintaining social cohesion. However, there is as well an open morality. Sometimes a radically new moral vision can appear through extraordinary individuals who open humanity towards universal love. This is a morality that embraces humanity as a whole. For history to advance, such figures occasionally must appear. And to be clear, Horkheimer agrees with a bit of this. History does change, generally new things do appear, and morality is not reducible to biological needs for society to exist. But society does contain forces that push beyond existing institutions. So something genuinely new does emerge, and it isn't just repetition, but Bergson fails to recognize that the open morality he talks about has social conditions of its own. As much as closed morality does, conformity is explained socially, but metaphysics have to be imported by Bergson to explain liberation as a result. This is kind of cheating, it's kind of a mystical explanation. If social conditions are what explains obedience, then social conditions also have to be able to explain revolt, ultimately. And where Bergson sees stable society, which isn't interrupted by occasional transcendence, what's actually happening is that contradiction inside society itself is occurring. The forces that produce conformity are as well what produces resistance. The new does not descend from heaven or out of nowhere, but from this historical tension. Bergson's solution to social problems is ultimately a sort of inner transformation, a new spiritual orientation in relationship to life, or, quote, humanity will change only if it wants to change. And that's a translated quote to be clear, but this ignores the fact that humanity is not in present reality a unified abstract concept which can be rationally organized. We live in a divided class society, and the collective subject of humanity does not as of yet exist, and so it cannot simply decide to change. A lot of what's being said here does have a lot of contemporary relevance to like discourses you see online and whatnot. I know a lot of people who, or I at least I know some people and see a lot of people who are, I guess, at least in name, like spiritual or whatever, or like Gnostic or something. And they have like, there's 100 different, varieties and labels for it. And they kind of view society as broken because people are thinking wrongly and need some sort of awakening, some sort of expansion to their consciousness that will allow them to, quote unquote, inner transform into some sort of greater version of themselves, I guess. And the purpose of this is to face the tides of the modern world. But this is more or less kind of ignoring the social structure underneath that creates these sorts of things, and simply it's just a facet of personal reproduction being completely individualized in the modern world. People in this like spirituality stuff and similar things like maybe Stoicism, Eastern Voodoo, whatever, directly mirror pro-capitalism advocates who posit that the system works like this because it gets at an ideal form of human nature. And so spiritual people ironically are as well making the exact same unfalsifiable state of nature argument, where they are concluding that the world is bad because of all these, innate things of human nature that are shared actually largely. They both think that people are all inherently in pursuit of money, power, etc. As much as possible, but have different responses to it. And in neither case is there an investigation of how institutions reproduce the incentive structure for this behavior. It's also kind of funny because in the section that I'm about to read, Bergson proposes simple living as a solution to how industrial society fails to deliver happiness. But the irony is that industrial society itself pushes people towards simple living, just not by choice. This is known as poverty, in case you were unaware. Simple living, yeah, it's called poverty. It's not liberation. It doesn't spiritually transcend you or whatever. People aren't actually excessively consuming at all. That's kind of the issue. Society is organized in such a way that people are not able to control their consumption effectively. And that's the problem with a lot of this, like, discourse about ethical consumption and whatever, or like ethical production as well, to an certain extent. Like, I don't know, just an example, maybe it's kind of weird, just something that came to my head is like sometimes there's discourse on Twitter about how like people who make like porn, like not like studios, like just random people who make porn, and there'll be discourse about, well, this type of porn's like unethical. And I was like, now I want to say I don't think that's it. You can't discourse on that. I'm not trying to say that there's nothing to be said there. There's no conversation to be had, but something I think is often left out is that I'm assuming if it's like a random person and they're making porn, even if the porn's like unethical in some way, again, I mean, there is a limit, there is nuance to this, but it's like my general position, my general baseline position isn't going to be a just blanket condemnation, because it's like I'm assuming, you know, unless I know like this person's like doing well, I'm assuming they're probably like, people don't generally, I don't think they're generally making porn because they just enjoy it, right? Same with any job, right? Because it's supposed to be just normal work, right? Like, people don't get a job because they enjoy working generally, right? They get a job because they have to, and if they're lucky, it might be a job that they at least remotely kind of enjoy, right? So I think that's like that's a majorly lost nuance, I think because people are kind of importing their assumptions about like content creators, like in general, like just general content creators who probably are doing it because they think it's fun, because they might actually have a job and they just are making videos for fun. I think people like that, the people who know about that, since that's so prevalent, they bring it over into every sphere of the internet where it doesn't really make sense to do. But anyways, back to this. His principal, this is a quote from Horkheimer, his principal fault seems to me to lie in the fact that he does not successfully conceive the interaction of sensibility and the understanding in the actual science, and therefore arrives at an unwarranted rejection of conceptual thinking. Which is to say, that seems a little complex, but it breaks down pretty easily. He believes, Bergson, that concepts distort reality, and that the world is effectively water, you know, like to reference the, you know, pre-Socratic conception. And so concepts are like freezing in the water, like freeze ice, I guess. And therefore, pure intuition is superior because it's like water, because it's like this, you know, universal mobilism. And okay, and to be clear, like, he is kind of true. Reality is indeed dynamic, but concepts are still necessary to understand it. We can't abandon thought, because this is equivalent to saying to abandon thought, right? But you can't just abandon thought, because it's like that. Then you're not able to really analyze things, which is kind of the point of theory, right? So you can criticize concepts for being insufficiently dynamic or missing stuff, but ultimately what we have to do is develop better concepts. History is not actually some sort of creative flow, but struggle, domination, suffering, etc. That's also all part of it. Like kind of what Spengler was saying in the last section. Like, that's also part of it. Okay, and if reduced down to creativity and psychological drives, like Bergson is kind of doing in this book, that erases antagonism and reifies appearance, which is also what Spengler does, just with the other direction, where he just only cares about struggle, domination, etc., and he doesn't care about anything else. But the task of critical theory is not to abandon or worship concepts, but to think dialectically about concepts in the world itself. Because Bergson ends up just dissolving conceptual solidifications, social problems appear more as spiritual problems to him, and the question of what social conditions make freedom possible remain unanswered. Anyways, that's basically a summary of what Horkheimer's about to say. Now I'm going to read the text. In his new book, Bergson does not simply restrict himself. Bergson, source, I don't know, some writing on Bergson. In his new book, Bergson does not simply restrict himself to a schematic application of his previous philosophical views to society. but instead offers a series of highly stimulating reflections on a number of social philosophical questions. It is clear that he is still closer to the impressionistic origin of his philosophy than he is to the political function his fundamental thoughts have since acquired by the virtue of historical developments. The intuitionism he once helped found now plays the role of a diversion from the theory of the tendencies of society as a whole. The new book shows that Bergson, to the contrary, is concerned, albeit in a highly abstract way, with the actual progression of history. In the spirit of French positivism, he explains morality and religion on the basis of the needs of society. The moral close aims of the conservation of the existing social structures. As the natural tendency of every individual human being to obey the system of customs that prevails in his social group, and to do so indefinitely, it corresponds to instinct in the rest of the world of the living. This morality consists in the fact that the individual conducts himself as a member of the social units into which he was born. It binds him to his family and his nation, and it separates him from the other families and other nations. The universal love of humankind, or humanness, is, according to Bergson, connected to the overt morals, and therefore must not be considered a mere extension of feelings related more immediately to instinct. The greater quantitative measure in its object corresponds to a difference in the quality of its affect. The moral ouverture appears to Bergson as the momentary unforeseeable incursion of the metaphysical stream of life in the human history. The points of incursion are those great men, certain whom's dont chacun se trus constitue une espèce composée d'un seul individu. These men give voice to a radically new sensibility for the world, one that is imitated by the many. The new becomes absorbed into the old circle of life and merges into it, at which point the circle becomes closed once again. Bergson fails to recognize the morale ouverte upon which, for Bergson, human progress depends, has social conditions of its own as much as the morale close, in accordance with the fundamental separation between intuition and analytical science in his philosophy. He separates the open, forward-thinking, revolutionary, and moral intuition from the system of customs that belongs to the self-preservation of closed society. Thus, he fails to recognize the fundamental dynamic of forward-driving and retarding moments within history, the dialectic of society close de ouverte. The distinction between open and closed morality corresponds to the distinction between dynamic and static religion. With his explanation of static religion as a system of narratives, Bergson once again displays his affinity to positivist naturalism. Static religion is nature's defense reaction against the thought of the inevitability of death. Mediated by the human capacity to create fables, it is therefore a purposive measure required by the kind of life which, in contrast to the life of the animal, has been endowed with intelligence. Static religion also promotes the subordination of egotistical goals to considerations of the general welfare. But without its development being identical to the development of closed morality, the function of static morality is always directly entwined with national needs. The tradition of religious narratives has its own history. Static religion, in contrast, is closed morality, need only incorporate social obligation, without which every social bond would be torn asunder. And yet static religion is merely the expression, in a sense, the formulation tempered by the understanding of the mystical certainty, whereby the human being knows himself to be one with the stream of life, with the power of creation that transcends all individual lives. Dynamic religion consists not in the narrative that blind intellect to one another for the sake of their continued existence, but in one's identification with the life each of us might find within ourselves, the life pulsing through and beyond every fixed form. All legends, all gods, are products of the creative activity from which the universe itself arises unceasingly. The true mysticism does not stop at ecstasy. Not only does it disseminate the content of its ecstasy through its teaching, but itself becomes the power of creation in which the mystic is immersed, and is expressed in his life. Sa direction est celle même de l'élan de la vie, elle c'est l'anime. In connection with this doctrine of morality and religion, Bergson subsequently turns his gaze to future development and states that industrialism et machinisme have failed to bring humanity to the happiness it once hoped they would. He believes in the overpopulation of Europe, indeed in the rapid overpopulation of the whole world, and so, like the late Max Scheler, falls prey to the Malthusian line of thinking. A true Lieben philosophe, the metaphysician, he finds salvation in inner conversion. He believes that simple life could replace the mechanismus of the present if the material pleasures sought after today were to fade before a new mystical intuition. In a passing remark, however, Bergson says that the needfulness of human beings in the present stems from the fact qua la production in general nitant pas sufflument organis las products ne trovant pas eshinga. He had pursued this thought in it might have led him out of philosophy into science. La humanité ne se modifera que se elle vet se modifier la humanité. However, he has for the time being as little unified as will as it does a rational form of organization. The roots of this want can be comprehended only through a rigorous study of the most advanced economics, and psychology. If simple life could help humanity, it would long since have been rescued. For the overwhelming majority of all humans live in misery. As little as the finiteness of knowing can be overcome by the immersion in creative life without regarding for rational science, just as little will social need fade away by turning inward. The intuition from which Bergson hopes for salvation in history as in knowing has a unified object: life, centrifugal force, duration, creative development. In reality, however, humanity is sundered, and the intuition that would penetrate through the contradiction into unity loses sight of what is historically vital, what lies right before its eyes. Excerpt from Horkheimer to Hans Cornelius. At present, I am in the midst of completing a rather comprehensive critique of the latest book of Bergson's, La Pensée et la Mouvante. He belongs, after all, to those few philosophers who deserve to be taken seriously. His principal fault seems to me to lie in the fact that he does not successfully conceive of the interaction of sensibility and the understanding in actual sciences, and therefore arrives in an unwarranted rejection of conceptual thinking. Such disregard leads him to create the myth of the Lebensstrom, which flows through the world, of a harmonizing fable in the most blatant contradiction with the actual course of human history. On irrationalism in philosophy. The descendants of the old rationalism and empiricism have defended themselves against the increasing ostracism of thought, in part with very astute arguments. Some have even pointed out that the social functions of irrationalism, Rickert, for example, describes Scheller's book on the genius of war, which serves to justify war as the climax of state effectiveness, as entirely consistent with the spirit of Lebensphilosoph. Anyone who not only sees that natural vital life is growth, that it struggles against other life as check, but at the same time sees in this biological law a norm for all cultural life, must indeed think like Scheller. Excerpt from Adorno to Horkheimer, 225-35. I have read the new issue of the ZFS with great enthusiasm. I found the Bergson essay quite extraordinary. The passage on the historian as receiver moved me most profoundly. It is astonishing how completely here the consequences of your atheism, about which I believe you less and less the more fully you explicate it, for with every explication, this metaphysical force intensifies, runs into those of my theological intentions, which, however uneasy they make you, nevertheless have consequences which are entirely indistinguishable from yours. I could even invoke the motive of the rescue of the hopeless as the central motive of all of my efforts without needing to take anything more, except perhaps to add to that the historical depiction of suffering in the non-emergence of the reader, about whom you remain silent, but is nevertheless the sole reader to whom such a history of creaturely suffering could be addressed. And of course, I believe that just as not one of his thoughts would have a right to breathe if it were confronted by your atheism, it did not prove itself unconcealed and true, so too not one of your thoughts could be thought without this. What for, as a source of strength through death, which burrows more forcefully into your thinking the more tightly you try to seal it away. Just as that ray of light, which is not blocked by any wall, but even possesses the power to reveal the innermost composition of the wall itself. I do not believe it would be a pointless and ideologically bourgeois beginning if we finally, instead of leaving this question unresolved, not as thought it could be solved, yet we can renounce its solution even less. Talked this matter through to the end, and unraveled it in full, and for my own part, I can imagine all manner of social theoretical consequences could stem from this, which would therefore also justify such a beginning when considered under the aspect of your present anti-metaphysics. Excerpt from Adorno de Horkheimer, 8/21/35. Germany was more horrific than ever before. The country has truly become hell, down to the smallest details of daily life. As for the fates of those closest to us, we only know so much. Lizo Paxman is dead. Official reports say she died of pneumonia at her relatives. In reality, for more reliable sources, she died a political prisoner in Dusseldorf. No one even knows where and whether she committed suicide, as they reported, or she was murdered. Perhaps the Institute can make inquiries. Willy Dorter has been sentenced to many years in prison for dissemination of communist propaganda. Langerhans has disappeared. No one even knows if he's still alive. Even Gunther Stern's sister is in prison, serving a year-long sentence for harboring communists. You've surely heard of the Dubislav case. It has directly nothing to do with political matters, but is only conceivable against the background of all the horrors of Germany. After his wife mysteriously committed suicide, he gouged out his girlfriend's eyes with a corkscrew. He's in custody, now in a clinic where they're keeping close observations of his mental state, writing his autobiography under the title Love Blinds. In this case, at any rate, it did the other. This is the horizon in which I have had to exist for 4 months now. You can imagine then how I'm feeling. You ever ask someone how they're feeling and they just reply like this? What do you even say to that? I have doggedly applied myself to a study of your work, and I found some happiness in this. I have just made this connection between two of your insights. First, your theory of the dependence of prediction on its object against Husserl's belief in predetermined objects as such, without consideration of whether their structure can or even must be changed. Second, your critique of Bergson, who undialectically dissolves conceptual solidifications without, at the same time, assuming their cognitive function. In other words, against his undialectical dynamics, I regard his analysis a decisive achievement.